What's up? It's Matt. This is a 10-minute Bible Hour podcast. And that sound right there is the last candy cigarette in this box, or, as they ought to be better referred to, a devil's sliver. But they're just so delicious despite all the dangerous things that these might lead to. I wish I had a candy cigarette to give literally every one of you because of how good it tastes in my mouth right now. You know what doesn't taste so good in my mouth right now, metaphorically, is the horrible behavior of Judas toward Jesus, because we've been looking at Matthew 26. Oh, that is so good. And this horrible betrayal passage. And then, understandably, Peter's like, you know what I ought to do? Kill the people who are doing this to Jesus. So he goes to get started with that project, and Jesus is like, knock it off. And you and I have spent a bunch of time focusing on the first reason that Jesus gives for why we're not going to go swinging swords around to make Christianity happen. And that is simply that there's a danger to it. There's a reflexive property to violence. Those who draw the sword will die by the sword. And we've considered that in light of church history. We've considered that in light of the Old Testament. We've considered that in light of the teachings of Jesus. I guess we kind of got cut off on the church history thing. It's kind of conveniently we didn't get into any of the Protestant stuff because, I'm a Protestant, so I don't want to make any of that look bad. But seriously, like very shortly into the Protestant Reformation, we see Catholic on Protestant violence. We see eventually Protestant on Protestant violence directed at the Anabaptists. And then as we get into the age of colonialism, we see a whole bunch more violence from different Christian groups in different ways. And just in general, it's never an attractive fit for people who are kingdom citizens. It's not a good look. And I suppose we could have an entire podcast where every day we look at some new place where someone in the name of Jesus in the last 2,000 years drew the sword inappropriately and probably often was on the receiving end of a sword eventually. But having spoken to all of that, one of the reasons that Jesus had to put the sword back away to Peter is simply this reflexive property of violence. But the second reason that Jesus is telling Peter to stow the sword is because he doesn't need Peter's stupid sword. He doesn't need the violence of kingdom citizens to achieve his purposes. Do you think I can't call on my Father until at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Jesus says that in verse 53, the very next thing after the whole live by the sword, die by the sword business. And I think it's really interesting that that claim comes right on the heels of Jesus being more or less comparatively ignored in the previous paragraphs. He's up here talking about letting this cup pass from him and crying out to his Father, and he's in agony to the point of death. He's overwhelmed. And the Father's like, yeah, we're going to go ahead and do the plan. But it tells you something about the power and the authority of the Son that he apparently in that prayer withheld the demand of the release of the forces of heaven or the power of heaven to bail him out. All of that prayer was still in submission to the plan, to the will of the Father. But Jesus is saying here, like, if I want an army, like a real army, you guys don't think I have that? And it sounds kind of insane to you and me sitting here. It sounds like tilting of windmills, Don Quixote kind of stuff. Delusional, crazy, but then you think about all the stuff that the disciples had seen, and bringing dead people back to life and conquering nature repeatedly and transcending distance and provision and everything else that's happened. It really doesn't seem that far-fetched that Jesus would have access to a legion of supernatural beings who could thwart any plans of human hands or human minds. And so, again, the second reason that Jesus throws this out, like, your violence is just dumb. It's unneeded. We don't need this to advance the kingdom. We have access to all the violence we want as, God. You'd be amazed at the things that my Father could do, that I could do if we wanted to, but we're doing a redemptive plan here, and this is where we're at in the plan. And then a third reason that Jesus tells Peter to stay his sword and not to do the violence thing comes up here in verse 54 of Matthew 26, where he says, "But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" Okay, what scripture in particular are we talking about here? Well, in our little jaunt over into Luke 22, the parallel passage over there the other day, we bounced back to Isaiah 53, well, the end of Isaiah 52, and then into 53, and we read all of that. Well, I guess in reference to then the question I'm asking right now, like what scriptures is Jesus talking about that have to be fulfilled? I don't know. All of Isaiah, all of God's promises to David and Abraham and Moses, what scriptures have to be fulfilled? Let me think. The entire plot of the Old Testament. Let me see what else. The entire plot of all of human history and existence. I mean, all of it points to this. So I don't think it's weird that Jesus in this situation doesn't point to like one specific verse and like, no, it has to be this way or else that verse won't happen. It's all culminating here. All of the arcs, all of the outstanding storylines from the Old Testament that have been floating around back there, they're all culminating, converging, congealing on this point in history with this character and the stuff that's about to unfold right here. So why are we not going to do the violence thing? Well, we got 3 reasons so far. One is that if you use the sword, you die by the sword. It has a reflective quality to it, and we've seen that in history and in the Bible and in Jesus' teachings. 2, why are we not going to use the sword here? Well, because Jesus doesn't need violence. He could break out all the violence he wants to, and this is a plan that isn't going to be achieved using violence. That, again, quick side note, is another biblical motif. I mean, Egypt was defeated and plundered without an army, without a government, without anything. It was just by the power of God. Then third reason that we don't need a sword here is because Jesus has to go to the cross. This is the plan. The Father just turned him down on a conversation saying, hey, if there's any other way, let's maybe consider that other way. Nope. This is exactly how we're doing it. And Jesus has been spelling that out explicitly to his team for 10 chapters, which in my Bible, is that much. And that was a lot of pages for them to figure that out. But then there's also a 4th reason here, and Matthew is not as concerned with this 4th reason as Luke is, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. Verse 55, at that time Jesus said to the crowd, am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you didn't arrest me, but this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Okay, so obviously he rounds out the thought, again, going back to the fulfillment of things. That is Matthew's big point of emphasis in all of this. But Luke's big point of emphasis is a vindication of Jesus. Luke was a Roman citizen. He was a Gentile. He was thinking in a larger Mediterranean world context. And he knew that there would be a whole lot of people who would hear about this and be like, yeah, but he did get convicted of crimes, and those crime convictions did stick, and he did get executed by the state. I mean, they don't just execute people for no reason. He must have done something. And you might think, oh, that's crazy. People are way more skeptical of the government than that. And my response to you on that thought would be, are they? Really? Like, how much does some kind of charge from the government and the whole put him in the outfit and take him to court and charge him with the thing and whack the gavel on the table and say guilty and United States of America versus so-and-so. It all feels very, very official. I mean, in the end, it's a lot of paperwork, and sometimes justice comes out of all that paperwork. But generally speaking, human desire to have order and see things stick together is such that it prompts us to have a real bias toward anybody we see wearing stripes, or as it is now, orange. A real bias to imagine that they were indeed bad, because we don't want to believe that systemic injustice might be a thing. But history tells us it is, and that governments do not always get that right. And so, yeah, I think the Mediterranean world probably would have been really credulous and been like, nah, Jesus was probably guilty and bad. I mean, he got convicted and executed. What did he do? He must have provoked. That is not Matthew's chief concern. He thinks it's abundantly clear as he's writing to people who already don't like the Romans. Like, look, this is a sham. The whole thing's a joke. And the punchline for Matthew is, and your guys, your religious leaders were in on it. They were in on the corruption. They're not pushing back on the corruption. They're playing along with it. And the result was your Messiah got executed by your religious leaders. Look how he's the fulfillment of all the things. Luke, on the other hand, is trying to make the case Jesus was innocent and the verdict was wrong and he was wrongly executed. And his vindication is the fact that he came back to life. So he actually was God and he did actually have the right to say all that stuff. And the stories about him are true. It's all true. And you should probably respond to this too, as the people in Acts go on to do. And so there's a little nod to that here in this fourth reason that Jesus says, let's not do the weapons thing. When he says, again, am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. So the jab here comes in two parts. And one part is, you had every opportunity to do this in broad daylight. Why didn't you do it there? Yeah, probably the same reason you wouldn't answer the question that I asked back to you about John's baptism, where it came from. Because you're terrified of the people, because you know you don't have a hold on them. He doesn't have to say any of that. They know exactly who they are and what they are. But the other half of this fourth reason of this answer is that, this is what the people who are wrong do. This is how they behave. And we're not going to create any confusion here. We're going to have a clear distinction. They're the ones who had to show up with swords and clubs. I didn't have to show up with swords and clubs, so put it away, Peter. So you got four really good reasons that Jesus says to put away the sword. And for that reason, I don't feel like we have a universal prohibition on self-defense, even though I tend toward being pretty anti-war, pretty anti-violence. I have to acknowledge that there are other people who make a competent biblical case for just war and other things that we're not going to explore right now. My point is that Jesus is definitely speaking to a moment here. I, for one, think that what he's saying here goes well beyond the boundaries of this particular incident. There are other very smart, very competent people who might argue that a little bit differently. And I always think it's fair and right to acknowledge that instead of just pretending that my opinion, preference, or read is the only one and that you therefore automatically have to think it too, or we're just not friends anymore. Next time around, we're going to talk about what this theme of fulfillment that I was alluding to throughout the book of Matthew. I mean, we're getting toward the end of all of the fulfillments. Seems like a good time to be like, all right, well, how much of that popped up and how much of what Jesus just said is true? What is he actually fulfilling? What would have been ringing in the ears of the original audience and the ears of his disciples that they would have been like, yeah, it's true. We can't kill these guys. Jesus has to get arrested because indeed this is the fulfillment of all of that stuff from the Old Testament. So we're going to have fun with that tomorrow. All right. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you got a box of candy cigarettes handy, pop those things open, crunch into one, and think of me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.